Good morning to all of you, and it's probably fitting that I come as last to talk about East Asia, because to some extent what we have to do is to react to what's going on in China, United States and Europe, which are the sort of the three big building blocks when it comes to industrial policy. You also noticed that I illustrated my title slide with a map of the world that looks a little bit different than what I'm used to here in Europe, where we always put Europe in the middle. Just try to figure out where the UK is on this map. Right? The map is one that perhaps is more reflective of, I should mention that I'm working and living in Singapore. I don't look very Singaporean, I admit that, but I work and live in Singapore, and that I'm talking about East Asia a little bit as somebody from Luxembourg would talk about the European Union, right? So I'm quite modest in what I'm telling here today. But I should say that the map that I have here, which I sort of found by coincidence, is a map that is perhaps more reflecting of how we see the world today from Southeast Asia. And you will notice that, yes, the US is there on the top, and Latin America is there somewhere on the bottom, but is really focused on, in the middle, on China and India, which are driving what our industrial policies are all about. The map also indicates how big Africa is on this here, and we haven't talked about Africa until now, and probably during the day we won't talk too much about it, but it is actually a very important part of what the global context is in which we are operating, and I would like to remind us of that. I start by talking a little bit about the existing situation, and I don't pretend to be a specialist neither on Japan nor on the Republic of Korea, so I talk about Northeast Asia, and I've based the few points there on the excellent reports that were made by our colleagues in the Babbage group from Japan, Sato and Arimoto, and then of course Professor Park and Kim, who worked on the report on Korea. And if I try to summarize these two excellent reports, and I do really not credit, or don't really give credit to the richness of these two reports with these 5 or 6 bullet points here, and so I encourage you to go to the website of the Babbage Forum and look at their reports. But if I try to summarize what I see in those reports is, first of all, very robust, mature organizational structures and processes. Referring to what Mike said in the beginning, it's one of the elements of what we looked at in our comparative studies. That is, what are the organizational structures, what are the processes through which industrial policy is determined, in IIP, Industrial Innovation Policy. And you see in these two very highly industrialized countries, robust structures and processes. Having said that, what I picked up, and this is of course my personal interpretation, is that it is to a large extent focused on upstream science and technology development. It is far less on the downstream technology development, application, innovation. And it is perhaps in a tradition that goes back to what happened in the United States in earlier days, very much focused on upstream science and technology development. There are some recognized issues. I don't call them problems because, as I said, these are mature and robust structures, but there are some issues that are recognized, and that is, in both countries, a lack of multi-agency coordination. And I don't think this is limited to those two countries. I think that we recognize that in Europe as well. And interesting enough, a lack of international collaboration. Lip service paid to international collaboration, some international collaborations through universities, but when it comes to truly international collaboration, opportunities to work together between Korea, Japan, China, Southeast Asia, these opportunities are perhaps not fully exploited. Interesting, when I look at those two reports, I also see that there is a new focus on applied development and stimulation of startups. And when I say new, it doesn't mean that that is 2023 or 2022, it's perhaps the last 10 years. But it is true that in both countries there was an emphasis more on larger industrial companies, the Samsungs of this world, to take some of the icons, the Samsungs or the Toyotas of this world, and that perhaps there was less attention paid to the startups, the stimulation of startups, and of course the new focus on applied development. And then when it comes to the content, that third leg of what Babbage has been talking about, I took two phrases from each of the reports because I thought that they were very interesting in terms of the trends that we see. That is, first of all, in the report on Japan, we see that there is an emphasis on under the Kishida administration of reforming economic and social systems and realizing people's well-being through the use of science and technology. And I think this is something that is underlying in what's happening in East Asia, that is this emphasis on what's the impact that we can have on society through science and technology. And the second one from Korea is from Professor Park's comments as solidify technology sovereignty. The independence that we already heard in some of the other introductions this morning, and the technology sovereignty to overcome geopolitical divides and the sanctions. And we should not forget that this is not only the divide between the US and China, dominated groups of countries, but it's also about the fact that Korea had to suffer from some sanctions or some limitations by Japan of the export of products that were essential to chip production. So it is actually an emphasis on technology sovereignty. And I would say that these two comments, impact on society, technology sovereignty, is something that I see throughout the whole of East Asia. The other part, of course, of Asia, of East Asia, is Southeast Asia, or ASEAN, if you want to focus on it, with more than 600 million inhabitants and a GDP that is more than 3.3 trillion. It is, of course, a highly diversified group, and talking about ASEAN as a whole doesn't probably make a lot of sense. It goes from some of the richest states in the world, like Singapore and Brunei, over several industrialized middle-income countries. And we shouldn't forget that countries like Thailand, Malaysia have actually a quite strong industrial capability. To go back to that comment that Mike made, what are the capabilities that you build, that have you built up? Most of us probably identify Thailand with tourism, but actually the industrial capabilities of Thailand are pretty strong. Also in Malaysia, we have, if you think about Penang and other places, have very strong capabilities. And I would even say that while Indonesia is a very complex country and a very diversified country, that some parts of Indonesia are highly industrialized and actually can be counted into middle-income countries. Of course, then we have some of the poorest countries in the world, like Cambodia and Myanmar, which are also rife with civil war, etc. So it's very difficult to make any conclusions, general conclusions about ASEAN. But, and I wrote there, yet there are some common elements that one should never forget when you think about Southeast Asia. And that is, first of all, a deeply ingrained, I would even almost call it the DNA of the place, is one of localization and import substitution. And so a lot of the industrial policies, while these countries are so diverse from each other, have a very strong emphasis on import substitution, localization, and have a whole set of direct and indirect subsidies to stimulate local manufacturing. And important there is that when we talk about local manufacturing, that without actually seeing this as a general policy of ASEAN, I would say that there is an implicit objective to ensure that 20% of the GDP is actually derived from manufacturing. Now, the 20% is higher than Japan, which is 17 or 18%, if I remember, or Germany, definitely a lot higher than the UK, where the GDP contribution of manufacturing is around 10 to 11%, if I remember well. Second characteristic is that while ASEAN is described to many as a talk shop, where people come together once a year to have some golf events between the leaders of the different countries, where some leaders seem to be looking for places to meet each other, where they can do good shopping, etc. Sort of that's the negative view of ASEAN, the talk shop. The reality is actually that it is a shop that works by consensus building. Very different from the European Union, where you have supranational institutions. It is a group that moves forward by consensus building. And that consensus building is actually often a reaction to what's happening elsewhere in the world. And I will come back to that in a second. But one of the most important parts of that is the connectivity. Connectivity in transport, connectivity in information and communication technologies, connectivity in energy, production, transport, storage, and consumption. And tourism, of course, are key elements of the physical and people-to-people connectivity in the region. But that word of connectivity is a very important part of what ASEAN strategy is all about. And then thirdly, interesting enough, and I refer to my own contribution to what, and that you can find on Babbage, but is that when you look at Singapore as sort of, I wouldn't say the informal leader, but yeah, I can say that. They will never say that, because that then they would get into trouble with the other members of ASEAN. But the informal leader of ASEAN, they have a very high investment in research and development, in higher education. And in particular, I developed this sort of document where you see the development of 23 industry transformation maps. In other words, there was this idea in Singapore that we don't want to add another sector or another activity to what we already do in our portfolio of activities, but we want to deepen the capabilities. Coming back to the point that you made, Mike, about what are the industrial capabilities that you have. We want to deepen the industrial capabilities. And they've actually developed very detailed transformation maps for 23 sectors, as I said, which each time focus on 5 elements. That is skills development, who are the people that we need and what are the skills that we need for this particular sector. How do we do improvement of productivity? How do we innovate? How do we anchor ourselves in the global map? And how do we enhance sustainability? Now you can say, and I started by saying, describing East Asia from my perspective in Singapore is like describing the European Union from Luxembourg. But the reality is that what Singapore is doing is actually followed by other, and which, by the way, it did following what happened at the European Union or in Japan, which had similar transformation maps. But this example of Singapore has been in the tradition of ASEAN, where you build by consensus, look at each other's experiences, learn from each other. Other countries like Thailand and Malaysia have actually followed the example of Singapore in developing some of these vertical transformation maps in different industries. Now, given that background, I actually had a few informal conversations with people at the level of where industrial policy is determined in ASEAN and in Singapore, and I asked them what the current challenges are that would influence industrial innovation policy. And I came to 6, of which a few of them are probably opening open doors, very similar to other countries. That is, first of all, the whole issue of sustainability and global warming is influencing, like in Robert's presentation for the United States, is one of the key elements that influences the evolution of industrial policy. All of the countries have, to some extent, set objectives in terms of carbon reduction, shift towards electrical vehicles, etc., etc. As again, ASEAN is a very diverse group, so they do it to different extents, but they all have committed somewhere to objectives in terms of improved sustainability and reduction of or contributing to the reduction of global warming. The second point, and is an interesting one, which is probably specific for East Asia is the whole issue of demographics and the tension that exists between two groups. There are, first of all, the countries like Thailand, Singapore, Taiwan, China, Japan, Korea, which suffer from aging of population, a very rapid aging of population. There are then a few other countries, and I haven't spoken about India at this stage, but India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, which have actually demographic dividends, and where you still have a big group of young people. And this whole tension between those two groups of countries and how that will sort of work out over the coming years is an interesting tension. I compare it very often in other contributions that I make to the migration crisis or the migration challenge that Europe has currently, where it looks like an unsolvable problem. I think that the demographics and the tension that exists between aging societies and societies with the demographic dividend is an interesting challenge for East Asia. Thirdly, again, opening an open door is digitalization, but an interesting question there is the whole issue of localization of data. Remember that I said that localization and import substitution is in the DNA of what Southeast Asia is all about. The control over data is actually a consequence of that localization. Now we know that for China there is a very strong policy of localization of data. Data should not leave the country, should be stored into the country. Vietnam has a similar policy, Indonesia has a similar policy, and even to some extent Singapore has policies that go into that direction. So the whole issue of what do you do with data, control over data, is an important question. Obviously the supply chain restructuring that others have talked about here, whether it's as a consequence of geopolitical divides, decoupling, de-risking, whatever you want to call it, quoting Xing, by any other name, a rose still smells the same, right? But it's where the decoupling of different parts of the world leads to supply chain restructuring, which has had a big advantage or a big impact on Southeast Asia, I have to say, a positive impact. Vietnam definitely has benefited from it, but even what I see happening today in Singapore with the influx of huge amounts of capital that come to Singapore. Just to quote a number, we used to have in 2020 700 family offices in Singapore. We have now 2,100 2 years later. You can, when you know how much money you have to create a family office in Singapore, there's a lot of money that has come to Singapore. Obviously, the word strategic independence has been mentioned already before, but is also important in East Asia, whether it's Japan, Korea, or Southeast Asia, and the reaction to geopolitical divides. And then I would like to mention something. I was sort of surprised that Xiaobo didn't mention it at all, but that's BRI, that is Belt and Road Initiatives by China, which here in Europe, in my interactions, is seemingly always perceived as being only about infrastructure, but I have to have to say that from my Southeast Asian perspective, the soft BRI, the institutions that are created, the networks that are created, are equally important from my perspective than the pure infrastructure investments, of which some have failed, by the way, but many have succeeded. But actually the soft BRI, the soft Belt and Road Initiative, the university alliances, they were stopped a little bit during the pandemic for obvious reasons, but these university alliances with Central Asia, with Southeast Asia, are actually important elements of the Belt and Road Initiative and determine to a large extent how countries think about industrial policy. My final slide is then also about hesitations, and rather than expressing my hesitations, I took two quotes of ministers from Malaysia and from Singapore, and Zafrul Tengku Abdulaziz, who is the Malaysian Minister of Investment, Trade and Industry, said recently, ASEAN member states have emerged as the biggest beneficiaries of supply chain realignment amid rising political tensions. But there are challenges in the longer term. The rise of industrial policy in the United States and the European Union could disrupt the flow of investments into Southeast Asia, while the fragmentation of the global trading order along political lines threatens to undermine future partnerships. So a strong fear that while we benefited in the short run clearly from the supply chain reorganization, in the longer term, the rise, and it's interesting that he used the word the rise of industrial policy. In other words, a recognition that there is actually a significant change in the way the US and, or at least as our perception, there's a significant change in how the US and Europe look at their industry could be a mid to long-term threat. And then Lawrence Wong, who is currently the Deputy Prime Minister and the designate Prime Minister for Singapore, said recently on the 7th of September of this year, when he was opening the Global Foundries Fab, an investment of $4 billion in chip production, he said, "The new realities of business are driven not just by economic logic, but also geopolitical alignment and national security. We have seen the big countries like the US, China, Japan, and the European Union roll out massive subsidies to build up production capabilities in semiconductors closer to home. And now comes, I think, the important phrase, it will not be possible for small countries like Singapore to outbid these large players at the level of subsidies they are offering. But we do." So in other words, a recognition that the enormous amounts of money that are invested elsewhere, you can't outbid them. So you're going to suffer, basically. What can you do? We do have many things going for us. Our excellent connectivity, our reliability and stable business conditions, and also a critical mass of leading companies based here, which cover the entire value chain from design to wafer fabrication to assembly and testing. With my apologies for some of the typos here, but it is clearly a reaction to say we will have to live with these huge investments that happen elsewhere. We can't outbid them. The only thing we can do is offer a good business environment and be a great place to invest. So, but you can see the hesitations, the difficulties that actually countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia to some extent see on the horizon. That was sort of a quick and rather quick overview of what we see in reaction to what's happening in the three big players, US, Europe, and China. Thank you.